Hi, everyone. This is the first of two PowerPoints that cover the rise and fall of disco in the 1970s. And as I mentioned in class, the reason I cover this when I teach this course is because I think the rise and fall of disco reflects a number of changes that are happening in American society and culture in the 1970s. And I want to try to make some connections between the rise and the fall of disco music and some of those social changes. So let's dig into part one. I mentioned in class how some people saw disco as escapism, others saw it as hedonistic, and some people even considered it decadent as it became more pronounced. Where did this come from? What were the roots of disco? Well, I played some examples in class, and I mentioned that if you go back to the early 60s, Motown music that was extremely popular, an emphasis on danceable melodies and use of orchestration, string sections. These were elements that reappeared in disco in the 70s, along with some examples of Philly soul, which I'm going to talk about on the next slide. And the 70s was a period when there was a renewed interest in dance as opposed to just listening to pop rock music. Another reason for the rise of disco was the adoption of new technologies, and this was happening in music in general. Disco was part of a broader trend. Stevie Wonder, arguably the person most responsible, the artist most responsible for the popularization of the synthesizer in pop and rock music in the 70s. The use of sequenced drum machines was going to become an element within popular music and disco as well. And then there was the impact of film, particularly the film Saturday Night Fever, which we're going to talk about in these presentations, which mainstreamed disco music, made it much more popular, brought it to a much broader audience. And also the rise of DJs in the 1970s. Club DJs became very influential. This was driven somewhat by the economics of the 70s and club owners considering DJs more economical and frequently easier to deal with than bands. And DJs developed new techniques of blending one song into another, keeping people constantly on the dance floor. And stereo makers developed equipment to make this easier, although DJs were doing this on their own at first. The use of multiple turntables, which was going to become a part of hip-hop too, really started with disco. I played a couple examples of songs by James Brown in class, and although he's not really a disco artist, the change in his music from kind of traditional soul and rhythm and blues in the late 50s and early 60s, by the later 60s, he was doing music with a very strong emphasis on beat, not always danceable, but that emphasis on the beat would be part of disco. And I previously mentioned Philly soul, two prominent groups in that movement, the OJs and the Spinners. These were both vocal groups. They were part of a group of musicians and artists based in Philadelphia, they worked with about 3 different producers to develop the sound that became known as Philly soul. It also drew upon the influence of Motown and also this emphasis on very danceable melodies to go along. And I played the OJ's hit Love Train as an example of that trend. Barry White, I mentioned in class, another influential artist in this transition to disco, composer, arranger, singer-songwriter, very popular crossover artist. He had a tremendous white following too, and a lot of his songs, I wouldn't quite categorize them as straight disco, but they're definitely a step in that direction. The first hit song of the 70s, based entirely on the idea that dance was the song The Hustle by a producer and songwriter named Van McCoy, who worked in Philadelphia, went to New York City one weekend to visit a friend. They went to a club where Van McCoy saw people doing this dance he'd never seen before, and his friend told him, oh, that's this thing called The Hustle. And McCoy was so entranced by it that when he went back to the studio in Philadelphia, he worked up this instrumental track, The Hustle, that became a #1 hit. This was really the first dance craze since Chubby Checker's song The Twist in the early 60s. Everybody wanted to learn how to do the hustle. There were albums you could buy to play with instructions on how to do it. There was a thing you could buy that laid out like a twister pad that had the footsteps outlined that you could follow. And the hustle became, as I said, really the first kind of dance craze since the early 60s. The first real disco band to rise to prominence was this group Casey and the Sunshine Band, based in Miami, Florida. Interesting group in a variety of ways. They were completely integrated. In fact, the only two white members of the band were Harry Wayne Casey, keyboardist and lead singer that you see there second from the right, and his friend Rick Finch, the bass player, who's the person on the far left. They were the primary songwriters. And beginning in 1975, they had really an incredible 2-year run from 75 to 77, where they had a number of top 40 dance hits that really are the emergence of the disco sound. And I note here even that their hit, That's the Way I Like It, considered tame by our standards today, but at the time, some radio stations banned it. Donna Summer became the reigning queen of disco, one of the first pure disco artists. And unusual story in that she was originally from Boston. A background in gospel singing was discovered by the owner of a record label when he saw her performing in a German production of the American musical Hair in Munich, Germany. Donna Summer's husband was German, and that was the beginning of her breakthrough. And through the mid-70s, really through the end of the 70s, she was going to have a string of huge hits that, again, are straight disco music. Her breakthrough hit was the song Love to Love You Baby from 1975. I played a little bit of this for the class. As I note here, for a woman artist, female artist, this was probably the most sexually explicit song to that time to hit the top 40. It's also very influential for being one of the first examples of a song remixed for playing in a nightclub, with the club version taking up the entire side of an album. So by 1975, disco has emerged to the point where you have established disco artists who really are doing that genre of music, and it's becoming more a presence on the pop charts in the top 40, although there's still a tendency by a lot of observers at this point to observe it as more niche music. They didn't realize how big it was going to become, and we'll talk about that in the second PowerPoint.